Major portions of the world are in conflict, and some, in fact, are going to hell.
President Trump slams America's enemies during his first speech at the United Nations and calls for all countries to work together to fight terrorism. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We have team coverage of the president's speech and how it shapes U.S. foreign policy. Correspondent Mark Irons will bring us reaction to the president's war of words against rogue nations. But first, Wyatt Goolsby reports from the United Nations in New York City. Good evening, Wyatt.
Lauren, good evening from a very rainy New York City. President Donald Trump delivering a very combative speech here at the UN, addressing nations like Syria and Iran, calling them the scourge on the earth. But his most blatant threat was directed at North Korea when he used language rarely used for a U.S. president in this diplomatic call.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
President Trump denounces North Korea and its leader, Kim Jong-un, during his first speech to the United Nations. And the president warns America will strike back if attacked.
We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
President Trump, during his roughly 40-minute speech, urged nations to join together to stop rogue regimes like Iran.
It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime.
Syria.
The actions of the criminal regime shock the conscience of every decent person.
And Venezuela.
The socialist dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro has inflicted terrible pain and suffering.
Despite the harsh rhetoric, President Trump promised the United States will forever be a great friend to the world and its allies. Trump challenging the UN.
The United Nations can be a much more accountable and effective advocate for human dignity and freedom,
by offering to send aid to refugees,
which enables their eventual return to their home countries,
and promising to fight together for peace and justice.
And for the Almighty God who made us all.
President Trump still worries about the threat of what he calls radical Islamic terrorism. He also says it brings tears to the earth, and it says it's time that's why we come together to, quote, crush the loser terrorists. Lauren?
Is the president still threatening to withdraw U.S. support from the UN?
No, he's not, Lauren. At this point, President Trump has changed his tone on that. He's been holding several different meetings here at the UN, has complimented them for the reform work that they were doing. He's also very supportive of the new UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. Lauren?
You have mentioned before is Catholic. Thank you so much. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby at the UN. Praise for the president's speech. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says in his 30 years of experience with the UN, he has never heard a more bolder or courageous speech. For more reaction, correspondent Mark Irons reports from the White House. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. Not everyone was as enthusiastic as Netanyahu. Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein says one goal of the UN is to foster peace, but she says the president used it as a stage to threaten war. I spoke with an expert on international affairs who says the president was just being himself.
It was a very strong speech.
Brett Schaefer is an expert on international affairs at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank in Washington. He says the tone of President Trump's speech reflects his character.
He's very confrontational. He's willing to mix it up, and this was certainly pulling no punches before the assembled leaders of the world and the UN.
In his view, President Trump's choice of words on North Korea leaves little room for misinterpretation.
It is time for all nations to work together to isolate the Kim regime.
And is a direct glove thrown to the floor of the other member states in the UN General Assembly, saying that this needs to be handled quickly, or you know what the potential consequences of that are, and we're all trying to avoid those.
And the challenge Trump issued to fellow world leaders was equally clear.
If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph.
I think that China and Russia have the opportunity to put real pressure on North Korea to signal to that government that this is not only a course that is not going to be in their interest, but also threatens the interests of China and Russia as far as destabilizing their border, their region.
The president also blasted Iran's government in his speech, calling it a murderous regime whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. Iran's foreign minister is reportedly responding, calling the president's remarks mean and pointless. Lauren?
There were many other people who really criticized the president for his whole Make America Great approach to this. Now, the president said that the U.S. is a compassionate nation, and he cited billions of dollars in aid given to Syrian refugees. Have you heard reaction to those remarks?
We reached out to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Their executive director of Migration and Refugee Services says the bishops support the part of the president's speech that addressed refugees' basic needs, such as providing for nutrition and health care. But the USCCB believes there is still much work to be done on behalf of refugees around the world.
Correspondent Mark Irons at the White House. Thank you, Mark.